Officer Colt Mercer slapped a 74-year-old man across the face on a quiet stretch of Route 11 in Caldwell County, Georgia, laughed while the old man bled in the gravel and then arrested him for assault. He towed the car with the man's blood pressure medication still sitting on the passenger seat. He went back to the precinct, poured himself a coffee, and spent the morning telling his co-workers about it. What Mercer didn't know, what he couldn't have bothered to find out, because he never bothered to find out anything about the people he hunted, was that the man he'd put on the ground had raised a son alone after his wife died. A quiet son, a careful son, a son who had spent 14 years building federal cases against men exactly like Colt Mercer, and who at the exact moment his father's knees hit that gravel was standing in a federal building in Atlanta being told he'd earned 2 weeks of leave. That leave started immediately, and it was going to end Mercer's entire world. The morning of the last Tuesday in September arrived over Caldwell County, Georgia, the way most mornings arrived there in the fall, quietly without ceremony, the pale gold light spreading across the 2-lane roads and the flat stretches of pine and red clay like something being poured slowly from a pitcher. It wasn't the kind of place that made the news. It wasn't the kind of place that expected to. Elroy Beaumont had lived in Caldwell County for all 74 years of his life. And in that time he had learned the texture of its mornings the way a man learns the texture of his own hands without thinking about it, without having to. He knew which stretch of Route 11 caught the light at exactly the right angle in October to make the pine trees look like they were on fire. He knew which dip in the road held water after a heavy rain and which dry cleaner on Merritt Street kept their porch light on all night. He knew these things because for 38 years he had walked the same 6-mile postal route through this county rain and sleet and snow and a Georgia August that would buckle the knees of a younger man, and he had noticed everything. That was the thing about walking. You noticed. He had retired 3 years ago on a modest postal pension, the kind of pension that covered the utilities and the groceries and the medication with just enough left over to keep the Buick running and the porch light on. The Buick was a 1999 LeSabre navy blue, and it was the one thing in Elroy's life that he kept in a condition that bordered on the obsessive. The exterior was waxed twice a year whether it needed it or not. The interior smelled of eucalyptus oil from the small cloth sachet he kept tucked above the sun visor, a habit Clara had started in the early years when she said every car deserved to smell like a place you actually wanted to be. The seats were original but immaculate. The dashboard had no cracks. Every gauge worked. Clara had been gone for 11 years now, and the sachet still got replaced every 3 months. Some things you kept doing not because they made sense, but because stopping them would mean something you weren't ready to name. It was just past 2 in the afternoon when Elroy pulled out of the Caldwell County Pharmacy on Route 11 and pointed the Buick toward home. On the passenger seat was a white paper bag from the pharmacy, stapled shut with his name printed on the prescription label in the no-nonsense font that pharmacies everywhere seemed to share. Blood pressure medication. Dr. Ammons had been adjusting the dosage for the past 3 months. The original prescription wasn't holding the way it used to, and Ammons had told him plainly that missing even 1 dose could cause a spike, that at his age with his history was not something to take casually. Elroy did not take it casually. He took it at 7 every morning with a glass of water and half a grapefruit, the way Clara had taught him to take care of himself after she understood that she wasn't always going to be there to do it for him. "You have to be your own nurse, baby," she had told him once toward the end, her voice already thinning. "Promise me." He had promised her. He kept promises. The speedometer read 32 miles per hour. The speed limit on this stretch of Route 11 was 35. Elroy's hands rested at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, where they always rested, where he had placed them every single time he had driven this car since the day he brought it home from the dealership. It was a habit he had developed deliberately and consciously when Marcus was a teenager and had started riding in the passenger seat, watching everything his father did with the particular attentiveness of a boy who was trying to figure out the rules of a world that did not always make them easy to follow. Hands at 10 and 2. Pop Marcus had said once, only 12 years old, reading it out of a driver's education manual, he'd checked out of the school library even though he was 3 years from driving age. That's where they're supposed to be. That's where they are, son, Elroy had said. And they had been ever since. The gospel track on the radio, an old Sam Cooke version of A Change Is Gonna Come, had given way to static and then to a call-in talk show. And Elroy reached over to change the station without taking his eyes off the road. He found something smooth and wordless and turned it low. He was thinking about whether the tomatoes in the garden needed turning, and whether he had enough bread for dinner, and whether he should call Marcus this weekend, or wait until the boy called him, the way Marcus usually did on Sunday evenings, always just after 7, always with the same opening, "Hey, Pop, you eating?" He was thinking about all of this and absolutely none of it when the world behind him turned blue and red. The lights appeared in his rearview mirror like something emerging from a dream, sudden, aggressive, unavoidable. The strobe effect of the patrol car's light bar bounced off his mirrors and filled the cabin of the Buick with a flickering that made everything look unreal, made the ordinary afternoon suddenly feel like something that required a different set of rules. Elroy's stomach tightened. Not with guilt, he had not done anything wrong, and he knew it with the clean, uncomplicated certainty of a man who had been careful his entire life, but with something older than guilt, something that had nothing to do with what he had or had not done. His generation called it the reflex, the involuntary contraction of everything inside you when the lights appeared regardless of the reason, regardless of the context, because you had grown up in the South in the 60s and some lessons went so deep they became biological. He breathed through it. He told himself what he always told himself. Be calm, be visible, be exactly what you are. He checked his mirrors. He signaled right. He eased the Buick onto the gravel shoulder with the same careful, deliberate motion he used for everything, not hurried, not resistant, just correct. He put the car in park. He turned on the interior dome light the way Marcus had told him 2 years ago, when Marcus was first learning what the world could be. He placed both hands back on the wheel at 10 and 2 fingers spread wide and open. He watched in the side mirror as the patrol car door opened. What Elroy saw stepping out of that patrol car was a man who wore his uniform the way some men wear bad news, like it fit him, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like he had been born for the authority it suggested and had spent his entire adult life making sure everyone around him understood that. Officer Colt Mercer was 44 years old, white with a neck that had thickened over the years into something that looked less like anatomy and more like architecture designed to hold up a head that never tilted down in deference to anything. His buzz cut had grown out unevenly on the right side the way buzz cuts do when a man doesn't bother to maintain them properly, and his uniform shirt pulled tight across the shoulders in a way that spoke less of fitness than of a man who had once been genuinely large and had never updated his wardrobe to reflect the gradual change in composition. He chewed gum constantly, spearmint, always spearmint, and he did it with his jaw working in a slow, deliberate rhythm that was less about the gum and more about projecting the impression of a man who was never in a hurry, never concerned, never not in complete command of whatever room or road or stretch of shoulder he happened to occupy. He had been with the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department for 18 years, and in those 18 years he had built something that he thought of as a reputation, and that everyone else, the community members, the defense attorneys, the 3 internal affairs investigators who had opened files on him and closed them without action, thought of as a record. There was a distinction, and Mercer had never understood it, which was perhaps the most important thing to understand about him. His father, Dale Mercer Sr., had been the county sheriff for 16 years before retiring to a property on the east side of the county that had been purchased on a sheriff's salary in a way that required a considerable amount of creative accounting to explain. The department Colt Mercer worked in was in ways both structural and cultural his father's department. The sheriff who succeeded Dale Sr. had been Dale Sr.'s deputy for 11 of those 16 years. The sergeant who was Colt's direct supervisor had attended Dale Sr.'s retirement party and still called him sir. The internal affairs reports that had been opened and closed without action had been opened by people who understood the geography of loyalty in Caldwell County and had acted accordingly. Down at the Rusty Nail, the bar on County Road 7, where the deputies gathered on Friday nights, they called Mercer the landlord. It was meant as a compliment. It meant that he treated the county like a property he owned and everyone in it like a tenant who served at his discretion. Mercer accepted it as a compliment. He had been accepting things like that as compliments his entire life, which explained a great deal about the man he had become. He had been passed over for sergeant again 6 weeks ago. The reason given was vague, something about leadership metrics and peer evaluations. But the real reason, the one that nobody said out loud, was that 3 of the 5 people on the promotion committee had been named in complaints that Mercer had either originated or endorsed, and the calculus of protecting yourself from a man like Mercer was more complicated than it appeared from the outside. So he was still a deputy, still on the afternoon shift on Route 11, still sitting in the speed trap behind the billboard for the personal injury attorney on the highway, Haggart and Associates. Because you deserve more killing time. Nursing a cold coffee, already in a mood that needed somewhere to land. The Buick LeSabre appeared around the curve doing 32 in a 35. Mercer watched it pass his turnout, and something in him that operated below the level of conscious thought registered the driver's age, registered his race, registered the careful, deliberate way the car was being driven, hands visible, mirrors, checked speed, exact, and processed all of it as a reason to follow, rather than as a reason to leave well enough alone. He threw the cruiser into drive before he had formed a coherent thought about why. Elroy watched the deputy approach in his side mirror and did the calculation that men of his age and background had been doing their entire lives, the calculation of exactly how still to be exactly how soft, to keep the voice exactly how much of your own dignity you could preserve without triggering something worse. It was a calculation that should not have been necessary. It was a calculation that had been necessary his entire life. The deputy came to the passenger window first, which was unusual. Most stops started at the driver's window and stood there for a full 5 seconds without saying anything, just looking in through the glass with the flat expression of a man taking inventory. Then he moved unhurried to the driver's side, and Elroy heard the heavy crunch of boots on gravel and the slow settling of a gun belt, and then the knock on the glass. Not a request, a command. 3 sharp strikes that said, "Open this," rather than "excuse me." Elroy rolled the window down. The afternoon air came in carrying the smell of hot asphalt and pine resin. "Good afternoon, officer," Elroy said. His voice was steady. He had practiced being steady his entire life. "Was I speeding?" The deputy didn't answer the question. He leaned in through the open window, close enough that Elroy could smell the spearmint gum and something under its stale coffee. The particular staleness of a long shift, and let his eyes travel around the interior of the car in a way that was less about looking for something specific and more about establishing who was in charge of this conversation. "License and registration," the deputy said. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who had given this command so many times that the words had lost all connection to their meaning. "Certainly," Elroy said. "My wallet is in my inside left jacket pocket, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now." He said it slowly, the way Marcus had taught him, the way the protocol demanded, the way a man announces every movement when the man watching him has a gun on his hip and has not yet decided what kind of afternoon he wants to have. The deputy didn't nod, didn't acknowledge the statement. He leaned in further theatrically and sniffed the air in the cabin. "Smells like something in here," Mercer said. "Strong, like you're trying to cover something up." Elroy blinked. "It's eucalyptus oil, officer. I keep a sachet above the visor. Old cars get musty. My wife started the habit." Mercer's jaw worked the gum in that slow, deliberate rhythm. "Step out of the vehicle." Elroy felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not fear exactly, but the physiological cousin of fear, the thing his blood pressure medication was designed to manage. He kept his voice level. "Officer, I want to be cooperative. I need to tell you that I have high blood pressure, and I just picked up my medication from the pharmacy." He glanced at the white paper bag on the passenger seat without moving his hands from the wheel. "My doctor has told me that sudden exertion or agitation can cause a spike that's dangerous for someone my age. I am happy to provide all my documents right here through the window." Mercer looked at the pharmacy bag. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that is making his life inconvenient. Then he looked back at Elroy. "I said step out of the vehicle. Is there a reason, no?" The door was wrenched open before Elroy finished unbuckling his seatbelt. Mercer's hand closed around the shoulder of Elroy's tweed jacket, the good one, the one he wore for pharmacy trips and church, and anything that required him to present himself well in the world, and pulled. Not helped, not assisted. Pulled with the particular carelessness of a man who does not think about what he's handling. Elroy came out of the car sideways, his right hip catching the doorframe with a force that sent a bolt of pain up his side. His feet hit the gravel, and for one terrible moment he wasn't sure they were going to hold him, and then they did, and he was standing on the shoulder of Route 11, with one hand braced on the roof of his car and the afternoon sun bright and indifferent overhead. "I haven't done anything wrong," Elroy said. He kept his voice quiet. He was not arguing, he was stating a fact. "Hands on the hood. Turn around." Elroy turned. He placed his hands flat on the warm metal of the Buick's hood. Mercer kicked his feet apart, not sharply but not gently, either the toe of a boot against the inside of an ankle, in a way that communicated absolute indifference to the person attached to that ankle, and began patting him down with the rough efficiency of a man who is not looking for anything specific, but wants to make the act of looking as unpleasant as possible. "You want to tell me what you were really doing out here?" Mercer said. "I was coming home from the pharmacy," Elroy said. "I've been coming home from the pharmacy on Tuesday afternoons for 3 years. "Uh-huh," the pat-down continued. "And the tail light." "I beg your pardon, your left tail light. That's why I stopped you." Elroy was quiet for a moment. He was 74 years old, and he had been careful his entire life, and he checked the Buick every Sunday morning the way some men checked the score of the previous night's game. He had checked the tail lights that morning. "My left tail light is not broken," Elroy said. "I checked it this morning." The patting stopped. The silence on the shoulder of Route 11 lasted perhaps 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Mercer straightened up behind Elroy, and the quality of the air around him changed in a way that Elroy felt before he understood it, a tensing, a gathering, the atmospheric shift of a man whose ego has just been struck by a fact he cannot dismiss. Mercer grabbed Elroy by the shoulder and spun him around. They were face to face now, and Mercer was closer than any interaction between a law enforcement officer and a compliant civilian required him to be close enough that Elroy could see the individual hairs of the uneven buzz cut, could see the small pale scar on the deputy's chin from some old confrontation, could see the way Mercer's jaw had stopped working the gum and locked. "You want to say that again?" Mercer said. "I said my tail light isn't broken." Elroy kept his voice exactly where he had kept it the entire time. Quiet, steady, truthful. "I checked it this morning. That's all I'm saying." Mercer leaned in. "You're calling me a liar. I'm stating a fact." "Same thing." "No," Elroy said with a gentleness that was not weakness, but something considerably more difficult. The gentleness of a man who understands the danger he is in and chooses truth anyway. It isn't. It was the correction that did it. Not the first correction, not the second, but the third. The quiet, precise refusal to allow an inaccuracy to stand unchallenged, the absolute stillness of a man who had spent 38 years walking a route in all weather and delivering what he was supposed to deliver on time to the right address, and who had never in his life accepted less than accuracy in the performance of his responsibilities and could not, at 74, begin doing so now. Mercer's right hand came back past his shoulder in a wide arc. The open palm connected with the left side of Elroy Beaumont's face with a sound that traveled down the empty stretch of Route 11 and was heard by no one. No witnesses, no passing cars, nothing but the pine trees and the flat Georgia sky. Elroy's glasses flew off his face and skittered across the asphalt, coming to rest in the thin gravel at the edge of the shoulder. The force of the blow turned his head violently to the right. His knees unlocked. For a moment, he was simply falling. Not dramatically, not quickly, just the inevitable descent of a 74-year-old man whose body had been hit without warning, and then the gravel came up and met him, and he was on the ground on his side, one hand scrabbling in the small stones, the world spinning in a gray and blue blur. He could feel blood at the corner of his mouth. He could feel the warmth already spreading across his left cheek where the skin had compressed against bone. He could not find his glasses. Without them, the world was a smear of color and shape, the patrol car's lights still spinning their blue and red accusation at the afternoon sky. He did not cry out. He had been raised not to cry out, and he had raised his son not to cry out, and at 74 years old, with gravel pressing into his palm and blood on his lip, and the world tilted at the wrong angle, he held that still. He heard Mercer's voice above him saying something about resisting and arrest, and what happened when you didn't know your place. He heard the sound of handcuffs being unclipped from a belt. He closed his eyes. He breathed once slowly from the bottom of his lungs the way Clara had taught him in the years when the world had been particularly hard to carry. And then he whispered a single sentence to the sky and the pine trees and whatever Grace might be listening on a Tuesday afternoon in Caldwell County, Georgia. Lord, keep Marcus steady when he finds out. The holding cell of the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department smelled the way institutional spaces always smell of industrial cleaner applied over surfaces that the cleaner cannot quite reach, of the accumulated anxiety of hundreds of people who had sat in this same small concrete room and understood that the next several hours were beyond their control. The fluorescent light overhead had a flicker in it, a subtle rhythmic irregularity that would have been easy to ignore for the first hour and maddening by the third. Elroy sat on the metal bench which was cold despite the warmth of the afternoon outside and tried to take stock of himself with the clinical calm he had learned from a lifetime of delivering what needed to be delivered regardless of conditions. His jacket had been taken during processing. His wallet, his phone, and his watch were in a plastic bag somewhere behind the booking desk. His glasses had been picked up off the gravel by Deputy Mercer and placed in the evidence bag as well, which meant that the world existed only in the soft, imprecise way it existed, without them, shapes and colors and suggestions of things rather than things themselves. His left cheek was hot and tight. He could feel the swelling working its way up beneath the skin, the bruise building its dark architecture under the surface. His lip had stopped bleeding, but had thickened in a way that made it difficult to close his mouth comfortably. His right hip, where he had caught the doorframe coming out of the car, ached with a deep and specific persistence. None of this was what concerned him most. What concerned him most was the white pharmacy bag with his name on it still sitting on the passenger seat of the Buick LeSabre, which had been towed from the shoulder of Route 11 by a white flatbed truck whose driver had arrived so quickly after Mercer called it in that it was clear the call had been anticipated. The impound company was Dale Mercer Jr.'s operation. Dale's Towing and Recovery County Road. 18 bonded and insured and holding the exclusive towing contract for Caldwell County by virtue of a procurement process that no one had ever looked at too closely. That meant the Buick was sitting in a lot on County Road 18, locked and secure, with Elroy's blood pressure medication on the passenger seat. Dr. Ammons had been very clear. Not theatrical, not alarmist. Ammons was not a theatrical man, but specific in the way that physicians are specific when they want to make sure the information penetrates. Missing the medication for 12 hours could cause a spike. Missing it for 24 hours in a man of Elroy's age with his cardiac history was a scenario they needed to avoid. Elroy checked his wrist and found no watch. He looked toward the light in the ceiling and tried to estimate the time from the quality of what little daylight reached the small ventilation window near the ceiling. Afternoon. Still afternoon. But getting later. "Officer," he called toward the guard station, keeping his voice polite and level. The deputy at the desk was young, barely 23, with a face that hadn't quite finished deciding what it wanted to look like, and he was looking at his phone with the particular absorption of a man trying very hard not to be present in his surroundings. The young deputy looked up. His name on the badge above his pocket was Pruitt. When his eyes found Elroy's, they found the bruise on the old man's cheekbone, and something moved across his face, a recognition, a discomfort, and then he looked back at his phone. "Please," Elroy said, "I need my blood pressure medication. It's in the car that was towed. I need someone to contact the impound lot and retrieve it." Pruitt set his phone down. He looked at the guard station door. He looked at the door that led back to the locker room where Mercer had gone after processing. He looked at Elroy again. "I'll ask the sergeant," Pruitt said. He did not move. Time passed. The fluorescent light flickered. Outside, Caldwell County continued its Tuesday entirely unaware that an old man who had walked its roads for 38 years was sitting in a holding cell with blood on his face and no medication and no glasses and no phone and no way to call his son. 300 miles away in a federal building in Atlanta, a phone buzzed twice in the breast pocket of a charcoal suit jacket and was ignored. The regional director of the FBI's Southeastern Division was a compact woman named Patricia Owens, who had been in federal law enforcement for 26 years and who had a particular gift for recognizing in the faces of agents sitting across a conference table from her the specific combination of exhaustion and competence that indicated someone had just finished something genuinely difficult and genuinely important. She was looking at that combination now in the face of Special Agent Marcus Beaumont, who was sitting with his hands folded on the conference table in the way he always sat, quietly, completely still, like a man who had learned that stillness was a form of control and receiving the formal commendation for the dismantling of the Meridian Municipal Fraud Network. It had been 14 months of work. 3 states, 7 counties, 11 defendants, 42 counts across the federal indictment. Mercer had moved money through shell companies and construction contracts and school board discretionary funds in a web so carefully constructed that 3 previous investigators had looked at it and concluded that there was nothing actionable. Marcus had looked at it and spent 14 months finding the thread, pulling it slowly, making sure every knot was tied before he pulled the next one, and then bringing the whole structure down in a way that was so complete and so thoroughly documented that the defense attorneys had in several cases advised their clients not to bother with trial. "The best closer this unit has ever had," Owens said, closing the commendation file. "I mean that without qualification. The work on this case is textbook. I'm going to be sending new agents to study it for the next 10 years. Marcus nodded. He accepted the praise the way he accepted most things, without dismissing it, without performing modesty about it, simply receiving it and filing it in the appropriate place. "You're due leave," Owen said. "You haven't taken a personal day in 18 months. Take 2 weeks. I'll take the time," Marcus said. In his breast pocket, his phone buzzed. He didn't reach for it. "Starting now," Owen said. "There's nothing on your desk that can't wait." The phone buzzed again. Marcus looked at the window. 14 months, 2 weeks. His father's porch light on Beaumont Lane the way it was always on. "I appreciate it," he said. The phone buzzed a third time. In Marcus's experience, which was extensive and specific on the subject of what different kinds of phone calls felt like, 3 buzzes in a row during a formal meeting meant only one thing. Someone who knew his schedule well enough to know he was in a meeting and loved him enough to keep trying anyway. He looked at Owens. "Excuse me," he said. He didn't explain further. He was already standing. In the hallway outside the conference room, he looked at the screen. 3 missed calls, all from the same number, saved under a name in his contacts that he had entered the same way he entered everything straightforwardly, without sentiment masking the function. Miss Loretta next door. Loretta Simmons was 71 years old, had lived in the house next to Elroy Beaumont for 32 years, and called Marcus on his cell phone approximately 4 times a year, once to report that the gutters on the back of the house needed cleaning once, to tell him when she'd had his father over for Sunday dinner, once around Christmas, and once for emergencies. 3 calls in 7 minutes was an emergency. He called her back. She picked up on the first ring, and in the sound of her voice, the particular breathless, fractured quality of someone trying to control themselves and not quite managing. Marcus understood before she said a single word about what had happened, that something had gone wrong with his father. He listened, he did not interrupt. When Loretta finished, when she got to the part about the gravel shoulder and the tow truck and the police car driving away, Marcus asked her 2 questions, each one calm and precise. "Is he breathing?" "Yes." "Yes, I think so. I couldn't see from the porch, but he was moving." "Which lot?" "That Mercer boy's place on County Road 18. "Thank you, Miss Loretta," Marcus said. "I'm coming." He walked back into the conference room. Patricia Owens looked up at the quality of his face. She had been reading people for 26 years, and she had never seen an expression quite like the one on Marcus Beaumont's face at that moment. Not angry, not panicked, not disheveled in any way that ordinary people become disheveled by sudden bad news. It was more like watching a machine shift into a different gear. Everything was still operating. Everything was, if anything, more precise. But something fundamental had changed in what it was aimed at. Sir Marcus said to her, he had always called her Sir from habit, a military courtesy he had picked up from the older agents. "A local law enforcement officer has assaulted my father in Caldwell County and denied him life-sustaining medication. I'm going home." Owens was quiet for 1 second. "Do you want me to make a call?" "No," Marcus said. His voice was very quiet. "I want to do this by the book. I want to see them move first. I want everything they do on the record." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He looked at her once more. 2 weeks leave, he said, starting now. He was out the door before she finished saying his name. The government-issued Tahoe sat in the parking structure on the 3rd level, and Marcus was in it and moving through the building's exit onto the downtown street before the rational part of his mind had fully assembled a plan. The irrational part, the part that was not an FBI agent, the part that was simply a son, wanted the sirens, wanted the speed, wanted to cover the 300-mile distance between Atlanta and Caldwell County in the kind of time that only emergency vehicles covered it in. He drove at exactly the speed limit, hands at 10 and 2. There was a reason for the discipline, and it was not the reason that most people would have assumed. It was not about appearances, not about liability, not about the professional consequences of a federal agent being photographed running red lights on a personal emergency. It was about the investigation. It was about what Mercer had just given him without knowing it, and what Marcus intended to do with it, and the fact that what he intended to do required him to arrive in Caldwell County with his thinking intact and his judgment uncompromised. Rage was a legitimate response to what had happened to his father. He felt it precisely and specifically in the tightness of his grip on the wheel and in the particular focused silence that his mind had dropped into. He was not suppressing it. He was simply not allowing it to drive. He stopped once at a gas station on the county line between Forsyth and Caldwell, where the pine trees thickened and the road narrowed, and the character of the landscape shifted in a way that always told him without any sign being necessary that he was almost home. He pulled into the lot, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark with the windows down for approximately 2 minutes. The gas station's fluorescent canopy hummed overhead. Insects moved through the light. Somewhere in the tree line something moved. He opened the glove box. Behind his registration and his backup credentials case, there was a photograph small and worn at the corners, the kind of photograph that someone had printed at a 1-hour photo counter, back when those still existed, and had been carrying in wallets and glove boxes and jacket pockets for so long that the paper had taken on a softness that made it feel almost like fabric. It was a photo of Elroy in his postal uniform, the blue-gray jacket with the eagle patch on the left shoulder, the bag across his body, the easy posture of a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be standing on Beaumont Lane, with his hand on the shoulder of a 9-year-old Marcus who was squinting into the sun and grinning. Marcus looked at it for a moment. He put it back. He restarted the engine and drove the remaining 40 miles to Caldwell County at exactly the speed limit. He arrived at the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department at 11:42 at night. The building was a squat brick structure from the early 70s, badly lit with an American flag on a pole out front that had been up long enough to fade to a pale approximation of its original colors. The parking lot had 3 patrol cars in it and a light on in the intake area visible through the wire-meshed window beside the front door. Marcus did not put on his badge. He wore jeans, a plain gray jacket, sneakers. He walked up to the front door and pushed it open. The sergeant on the desk was a heavy-set man named Grady Nolan, who was working a crossword puzzle in a county newspaper that was 3 days old, and who looked up at Marcus with the particular expression of a man who resents any interruption of his crossword puzzle, regardless of the reason for it. Marcus stated his request clearly, and without any information beyond what was necessary, he was here for Elroy Beaumont, his father who had been processed that afternoon. He needed to confirm his father's medical needs were being met and to discuss the arraignment. Nolan told him that processing was closed, that arraignment was in the morning, and that if the old man was sick, the jail nurse would handle it. Marcus said that his father needed his blood pressure medication, that it had been approximately 9 hours since the last dose, and that the medication was sitting in a towed vehicle at Dale's Towing and Recovery on County Road 18. Nolan said, without looking up from his crossword puzzle, that it wasn't his problem, that maybe Elroy should have thought about that before he assaulted an officer. Marcus looked at Nolan. He looked at the clock above the desk. He looked at the badge number visible on Nolan's collar. He committed all of it to memory with the quiet efficiency of a man for whom this process was entirely involuntary. "Okay," Marcus said. "Tomorrow." He walked out. He did not go to a hotel. He drove to Beaumont Lane and the porch light was on. Elroy always left it on, always had, even in the years when Marcus was away for months at a time, as if the light was a standing acknowledgement that someone was expected home. And Marcus walked up the front steps and used his key on the door and went inside. The house smelled the way it had always smelled: eucalyptus oil from the sachets, old books from the shelves that lined the living room wall, and something underneath both of those things that Marcus associated with no particular scent at all, only with safety. He stood in the living room for a moment with the lights off and breathed it. Then he sat down in his father's armchair, opened his secure bureau laptop, plugged in an encrypted drive, and went to work. The file on Colt Mercer loaded in sections, each section arriving with the slight delay of a system that was on its end being appropriately cautious about what it was sending and to whom. Marcus read through it with his reading glasses on, the ones he kept in the laptop bag, because at 41 his eyes had begun subtly and unwillingly to make the same kinds of compromises his father's had made at 40. The disciplinary file was on its surface thin. 9 civilian complaints in 18 years, every one of them dismissed at the departmental level without proceeding to any formal finding. The language of the dismissals was varied in its phrasing, but identical in its conclusion: insufficient evidence not sustained, complainant declined to pursue, reviewed and closed. Marcus had seen language like this before. In his 14 years in the Public Corruption Unit, he had seen it enough times to know that not sustained did not mean did not happen. It meant that the person deciding whether it happened had a reason to decide it hadn't. The civil settlement records were more informative. 3 settlements in 18 years paid from county funds, totaling just under $90,000 across the 3 cases. Excessive force civil rights violations, false arrest. All 3 settled without admission of liability, all 3 accompanied by non-disclosure agreements, all 3 appearing in the county's general fund disbursements under a line item that was labeled with inspired bureaucratic creativity, legal resolution expenses. The impound data was what Marcus spent the longest with. He had requested full tow records for Dale's towing and recovery going back 6 years. The numbers that came back were not the numbers of a towing operation running a normal business. The average hold time for Caldwell County impounds was statewide approximately 4 days. Dale Jr.'s lot averaged 17. The average fee collected per impound in Caldwell County statewide was $140. Dale Jr.'s lot averaged $490. And the ownership structure of the lot visible in the county's business registration records and the LLC filings that Marcus's analyst in Atlanta pulled in the early hours of the morning showed a numbered limited liability company with 2 beneficial owners, one of whom was Dale Mercer Jr. and the other of whom was listed only by initials CWM, Colt Wayne Mercer. The routing of the impound revenue through the LLC to an account in Colt Mercer's name was not hidden so much as it was simply not looked for. No one in Caldwell County had ever looked for it because the people positioned to look for it were people who had, in one way or another, come up in the same ecosystem as the Mercer family, and understood that looking was not in their interest. Marcus opened a new, secure document. At the top, in plain text, he typed 2 words, Operation Landlord. Then below it, he began to build. He worked through the night. The house was quiet around him. The refrigerator ran. The porch light stayed on. On the mantel above the fireplace, Clara's photograph watched him work with the particular stillness of people in old photographs, present in a way that is different from presence more patient than anything living. And Marcus looked at her face once at around 3 in the morning and told her quietly in the empty room that he had it. He had all of it. He just needed time to build it right. He went to make coffee, and while it brewed, he stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark yard where Elroy's tomato plants were turning brown at the edges from the cold, and he thought about his father lying on that gravel shoulder, reaching for glasses he couldn't find. And he held that thought, the way you hold something that needs to be held before you can put it down and do the work. Then the coffee finished, and he poured it and went back to the laptop, and he kept going until morning. At 7:45 on the morning after Elroy Beaumont's arrest, the break room of the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department was occupied by 3 men, Officer Colt Mercer, who was at the start of a day shift and in a considerably better mood than he had been the previous afternoon. Deputy Robbie Taft, 15-year veteran, large and affable in the way of men who have not been required to develop any more subtle qualities. And Deputy Kyle Pruitt, the rookie who was 23 years old and 8 months into his first year in law enforcement, and who had been told in various ways, both explicit and implicit, that the first year was about learning how things worked, and not about asking questions about whether the way things worked was appropriate. Mercer was pouring his second coffee of the morning and recounting the previous afternoon's stop with the expansive performing quality of a man who has been waiting for an audience. So he's in his Buick, old guy, old car, cruising along, doing 32 like he's driving a school zone. And I pull him over right away. He starts in with the gentleman routine. Mercer affected a parody of an older man's measured speech, exaggerating the formality. Good afternoon, officer. Was I speeding? Like he's at the DMV? Like we're having tea? Taft grinned and leaned back in his chair. He had heard versions of Mercer's traffic stop stories before. They were a genre he enjoyed. "What was the stop for tail light?" Mercer said. Anyway, I tell him to step out, give him the standard, and he starts telling me about his blood pressure, his medication. He drew the word out with theatrical patience, the word of a man recounting an inconvenience. Like that's my problem, like I'm supposed to care about his prescription. "You let him take it," Pruitt asked. He was looking at his coffee cup. Mercer looked at the rookie. The car was already being towed. Pruitt was quiet. So anyway, Mercer continued, turning back to Taft. The real thing, he actually had the nerve to tell me his taillight wasn't broken. To my face. Told me he checked it that morning. Taft shook his head, chuckling. Did he now? Correcting me. Mercer set down his coffee cup with a slight emphasis that was not quite a slam. 70-something-year-old mailman thinks walking the same 6 miles for 40 years gives him the right to correct a sheriff's deputy. You know what that is. You know what that tells me, Taft? Who knew what answer was expected, said, entitlement. Entitlement, Mercer confirmed. Men like that, they get comfortable. They forget their place. And then they're surprised when someone reminds them. He picked up his coffee again and took a long, satisfied sip. Pruitt excused himself 2 minutes later, saying he needed to check the duty board. He walked down the hallway to the booking desk, stood behind it for a moment, and looked toward the holding cells. Then he sat down, opened his laptop, and stared at the duty roster without seeing it. In the corner of the break room ceiling, mounted above the coffee maker, and facing the table where Mercer and Taft were still talking, the small dome of a security camera's housing caught the morning light. It was one of 14 cameras in the department, installed 3 years ago as part of a county security upgrade that the sheriff had announced at a public meeting and then largely forgotten about. The cameras fed to a recording server in the basement IT room, where the footage cycled on a 45-day archive before being overwritten. Nobody had turned it off. The Caldwell County Municipal Court occupied the ground floor of the county building on Jefferson Avenue, a building that had been built in 1956 and had been promising itself a renovation for the past 2 decades without following through. The ceiling in the main courtroom was high and water-stained. The air conditioning unit in the wall rattled when it ran, which it did constantly and ineffectively against the Georgia heat. The gallery benches were wooden and uncomfortable in a way that suggested the architect had believed that discomfort was an appropriate accompaniment to justice. On the morning of Elroy Beaumont's arraignment, the gallery was full in the way arraignment courts are always full. Not with people who are there for any particular case, but with the general population of a county's legal system on any given morning. Family members of the other defendants, a few attorneys reviewing files, a municipal employee who appeared to have come in to stay cool and had fallen asleep in the 3rd row. Elroy was brought in with the first arraignment group. He was walking without assistance, but only technically. His right hand was on the railing of the defendant's walkway. His weight shifted slightly to compensate for the hip that had struck the car door. His steps measured and deliberate in the way of a man who is managing pain and choosing not to perform it. Without his glasses, the courtroom was a blur of shapes and light and movement. He could not read the face of the woman at the prosecution table. He could barely read the face of the man on the bench. He could see the swollen bruise on his own cheek reflected hazily in the water glass someone had left on the defendant's railing. The man on the bench was Judge Warren Platt. He was 63 years old, white-haired, with the jowly authority of a man who had sat in the same chair for 22 years and had allowed the chair over time to become an extension of himself. He was known in the county bar as a good judge, in the sense that the county understood good meaning, reliable, predictable. Unlikely to surprise anyone in ways that were inconvenient. He had been hunting deer with Colt Mercer's father on the 2nd weekend of November every year for 15 years, and the Mercer name in his mind had the weight and texture of something that did not require examination. At the prosecution table was Deputy D.A. Sandra Greer, who was reviewing the case file with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had 17 other arraignments after this one and no patience for complications. She had been told by the night sergeant that this was a straightforward resisting arrest and assault on an officer. Elderly defendant, clear-cut stop, no major injuries to the officer, and she had prepared accordingly. In the front row of the gallery, arms crossed, uniform pressed gum, working in that slow, deliberate rhythm, sat Colt Mercer. He had positioned himself where Elroy, even without glasses, would be able to see him. This was intentional. Mercer liked to be seen. He liked to be the last thing the person across the room understood about their situation. The bailiff called the case. Case number 497, State versus Elroy Washington Beaumont. Charges reckless, driving resisting arrest assault on a law enforcement officer. The murmur that went through the gallery was small but real. A retired mailman assault on a cop 74 years old, and several people turned to look at Elroy with expressions that ranged from skepticism to something more uncomfortable. Deputy D.A. Greer stood without looking at Elroy. She read from the file in the clipped professional tone of someone who had read from files so many times that the words had become sounds rather than meanings. Your Honor, the defendant was stopped yesterday afternoon on Route 11 by Officer Mercer of the Sheriff's Department for a routine traffic violation. The defendant became belligerent, refused lawful orders to exit the vehicle, and when Officer Mercer attempted to assist him from the vehicle, the defendant struck the officer with a closed fist. The defendant has no prior record, but given the serious nature of an assault on a law enforcement officer, the state requests bail be set at $40,000. Elroy put one hand on the defendant's railing. Your Honor, he said, his voice thin with fatigue and the after effects of a night without medication. I need to tell the court. You'll have your turn, Mr. Beaumont, Judge Platt said, not looking up from his paperwork. His tone was the tone of a man managing a full docket and a rattling air conditioner and a schedule that needed to stay on track. Though I'll say this, a man of your age striking a law enforcement officer, you should be ashamed of yourself. In the front row, Mercer's lips curved. Your Honor, Greer said, already beginning to sit. The state also requests a mandatory psychiatric evaluation to assess the defendant's fitness to understand the charges given his age. And, granted, Platt said. Bail is set at $40,000. Psychiatric evaluation to be completed within. The gavel had not yet come down. The double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, both doors simultaneously with the kind of controlled force that required both hands and a decision. The man who walked in was wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than 2 months of any deputy's salary. His shoes were black Oxford leather, polished to a depth that reflected the ceiling lights in twin perfect ovals. He was tall, 6'1" or 6'2", with the particular build of a man who had spent years in physical environments that required real capability rather than aesthetic performance. He carried a leather briefcase in his left hand and a manila folder in his right, and he walked down the center aisle of the Caldwell County Municipal Court with the unhurried, absolute directness of a man who had been in a great many rooms and had never in any of them needed to announce himself. He unlatched the low gate in the gallery railing without slowing. He walked through it. The bailiff, a large man named Roy Cadell, who had been doing this job for 11 years and had seen most things, stepped forward with his hand on the taser at his hip. It was the motion of a man doing his job, not a man who wanted trouble. The man with the briefcase held up a badge without breaking stride. Not a local detective's badge, not a state investigator's shield. A federal badge, gold and detailed with the particular weight and texture of something that is issued rather than purchased. The eagle spread across its face in the way that federal eagles do, with the settled permanence of institutional authority that has been operating since before Roy Cadell's father was born. Roy stopped. Marcus Beaumont came to rest at the defense table. He set his briefcase on the table, opened it with a single practiced motion, and turned to face the bench. Your Honor, Marcus said. His voice was entirely level, projecting with a baritone clarity that reached every corner of the courtroom without effort. "My name is Marcus Beaumont. I am a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Public Corruption Unit, Southeastern Division. I am also the son of the defendant Elroy Washington Beaumont. I am appearing before this court pro hac vice as counsel for my father, and I am formally objecting to the bail request and to the probable cause statement filed in support of these charges." Judge Platt's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, irritation, confusion, and then a particular kind of stillness that experienced observers of Judge Platt would have recognized as the stillness of a man recalibrating. "You can't just walk into my courtroom." Platt started. "I have walked into your courtroom, Your Honor, which is a public room in which I have every legal right to appear." Marcus opened the manila folder. The probable cause statement supporting the charge of reckless driving notes that Officer Mercer observed the defendant's vehicle crossing a double yellow line. "I have accessed the buffer recording from Officer Mercer's patrol car through the Bureau's lawful server, Access Your Honor. The recording shows the defendant's vehicle traveling in a straight line within the lane markings for the entirety of the observable approach. There was no lane crossing." In the front row, Colt Mercer had stopped chewing his gum. The color had not yet left his face entirely, but it had started the process, the first phase of a draining that in the next 30 seconds would become thoroughgoing and complete. I also note, Marcus continued, that Officer Mercer's dash camera was manually disabled approximately 90 seconds before the traffic stop was initiated. However, the patrol car's buffer recording system, which captures the 90 seconds prior to any manual activation, was not disabled. I accessed that recording through the Bureau's server clearance this morning. It shows the defendant exiting his vehicle in a compliant and cooperative manner. It also shows the assault. The word landed in the courtroom with the clean precision of something that had been aimed carefully. That's a manipulation," Mercer said from the gallery. His voice had shed its careful flatness. "You can't use that." "Sit down." "Officer Mercer," Marcus said. He did not raise his voice. He turned and looked at Mercer for the first time since entering the courtroom, a long, direct, measuring look that lasted 3 full seconds and contained in those 3 seconds everything that Marcus had spent the night building and intended to spend the next several weeks concluding. Mercer sat down. "Your Honor." Marcus continued, turning back to the bench. "My father is 74 years old. He is a diabetic with a cardiac history who was denied his blood pressure medication for 19 hours while in county custody. This constitutes a violation of the 8th Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, and I will be filing a federal emergency medical order within the hour if he is not released on his own recognizance and transported to receive medical evaluation." He paused. He let the courtroom absorb this. "I will also be filing a civil rights complaint under Title 42, Section 1983, and a federal criminal referral under Title 18 against Officer Mercer for the assault documented in the buffer recording. The county's failure to provide adequate medical care will be named as an additional count." Judge Platt: "If this court participates in prolonging my father's detention after the presentation of this evidence, the court will be named in the complaint." He looked at Platt directly. "I don't lose cases, Your Honor." The rattling air conditioner was the only sound in the room. Judge Platt looked at Marcus Beaumont the way a man looks at a structural change in the ground beneath him, not with immediate panic, but with the dawning terrible comprehension that what he assumed was solid had at some point while he wasn't looking shifted into something entirely different. He looked at the badge. He looked at the folder. He looked at the bailiff who was standing against the wall with his hand no longer near the taser. He looked at Colt Mercer. Mercer was white. Not the red and white of embarrassment or the gray of shock. He was white the way someone goes white when the blood genuinely leaves the face, the specific absence of color that indicates not an emotional response but a physical one. the body's acknowledgement that something catastrophic is happening. Mercer's eyes moved from Marcus to the badge to Elroy, who was standing at the defendant's railing with one hand on the rail and the other hanging loosely at his side, his face still swollen, his posture quiet and dignified in a way that cost him something to maintain, and that he maintained anyway. Their eyes met for a moment, the old man's and the deputy's, and Mercer could not, for reasons that he did not understand and would not understand for some time, hold the look. He looked away first. "Mr. Beaumont," Judge Platt said. His voice had changed. It had lost approximately 30% of its habitual authority, the way a room loses volume when someone opens the windows. The court is inclined to release the defendant on his own recognizance pending the submission of the additional evidence you've described. The psychiatric evaluation request is withdrawn." "Thank you, Your Honor," Marcus said. "The charges." "The charges will be addressed through appropriate federal channels," Marcus said. "For the moment, I need to take my father to Caldwell General Hospital." He turned from the bench. He walked to the defendant's railing and unlatched it, the second gate he had unlatched in the last 15 minutes, both without asking, and came to stand beside his father. He looked at Elroy. Elroy looked at him. Neither of them said anything in the courtroom in front of all these people and the rattling air conditioner and the man in the front row who was trying very hard to look less frightened than he was. Marcus picked up his father's arm gently and walked him toward the door. Caldwell General Hospital was a 40-bed facility that had been serving the county for 60 years and that managed through the dedication of a staff that was underpaid relative to their skills and the general quality of their character to provide care that exceeded what the building and the budget suggested was possible. The ER was quiet in the mid-morning, and Elroy was seen within 20 minutes of arrival IV drip for the blood pressure. A nurse named Donna, who had the matter-of-fact gentleness of someone who has delivered difficult care for many years and has learned to make it comfortable without making it soft. Marcus sat in the plastic chair beside the bed. He had taken off his jacket. He looked in the shirt and slacks and the lines around his eyes that the last 14 months had put there, and that had been there for the last several years, if he was honest about it, like what he was, a man in his early 40s who had been working very hard for a very long time and who was currently doing something considerably harder than his work. Elroy watched the IV line. He had his glasses back. Marcus had retrieved them from the evidence bag at the department on the way to the hospital quietly and without incident, because after what had happened in the courtroom, the desk sergeant had not felt inclined to create additional complications. With the glasses on, Elroy could see the room properly, could see his son's face properly, could see the specific way that Marcus held the tension in his jaw, that he had always held it the same way since he was 12 years old and working through something he considered it his responsibility to solve. "When did you last sleep?" Elroy asked. Marcus glanced at him. "I'm fine, Pop. That's not what I asked." A pause. "I'll sleep tonight. You drove 300 miles last night and worked all night." The coffee helped. Elroy looked at the ceiling. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet, the hospital made its usual sounds, carts in the hallway, a distant phone, the soft, persistent beeping of the monitor beside the bed. Then he said the thing that had been sitting in his chest since the holding cell, since the middle of the night when the fluorescent light flickered and the tremors started in his hands. "I kept thinking about all the men who don't have a son that can walk through those doors." Marcus was very still. "All the men who are in a cell right now," Elroy said, "with their medication in an impound lot, without their glasses, without anyone who can walk into a federal building and make a phone call that gets them out." He turned his head to look at his son. How many people has he done this to, Marcus? The question held in the room. Marcus looked at his father's face, the bruise that had deepened overnight into the kind of dark that would take 2 weeks to clear the swollen lip. The gray tiredness that was not Elroy's natural state, but that belonged to this particular morning, and he held the answer that was already assembling itself from everything he had spent the night reading. More than one, Marcus said. I know. We're going to find them all. I know that too, Elroy said. He reached out and took his son's hand. He held it the way he had held it when Marcus was 9 years old, and his mother had first gotten sick, with the same grip, strong and deliberate, and without any pretense of the comfort being greater than the circumstance warranted. I'm proud of you, Elroy said, but you need to be careful. That man, there's a darkness in him that doesn't care about rules or consequences. He doesn't think the way you think. Marcus looked at his father's hand in his. That's exactly what I'm counting on, he said. The secure laptop was open on the dining room table. Of the house on Beaumont Lane, when Marcus returned from the hospital that evening. Elroy installed upstairs with his medication and his dinner, and the television tuned to the evening news, which he watched every night at 6 with a specific critical attention that had not diminished in the 30 years since he had retired. What Marcus's analyst in Atlanta had been building since 4 in the morning was by now a structure. Not a collection of facts, facts were the raw material, but a structure meaning the facts arranged in the order and configuration that revealed what they meant and what could be done with them. The traffic stop records were the foundation. Marcus's analyst had pulled the complete dispatch records for Mercer's patrol assignments on Route 11 and the surrounding county roads going back 8 years. 340 stops. The racial breakdown was not subtle. 87% of the stopped drivers were black or Latino. Not a single traffic citation had been issued to a white driver on this corridor in 8 years of Mercer's patrol assignments. Not one. The impound revenue figures told a complementary story. Over 6 years, Dale's Towing and Recovery had collected approximately $2.1 million in impound fees from the Caldwell County contract. After overhead, the lot, the trucks, the employees, the county fee, the profit margin was roughly 63%. Of that profit, a percentage was routed through the Mercer LLC to an account in Colt Mercer's name. The analyst had calculated the total at just over $480,000. The case histories were what Marcus spent the longest with, and they were what moved him in ways that the financial figures, however damning, did not. 3 men, all black, all stopped by Mercer on Route 11, or the connecting county roads within the past 7 years, all currently serving state prison sentences on drug charges. In each case, the evidence had come from Mercer's patrol car, discovered in the vehicle during the stop, documented in Mercer's report, tested and confirmed by the county lab. In each case, the defendant had maintained innocence from the moment of arrest through the sentencing hearing. In each case, the public defenders who had represented them had been overburdened to the point where the case had been resolved through a plea agreement before any substantive investigation could occur. Their names were printed at the top of 3 separate files: Darnell Oaks, 41, serving 12 years; Terrell Mosley, 34, serving 8 years; Jerome Banks, 27, serving 15 years. Jerome Banks had been 20 years old when he was arrested. Marcus sat with those names for a while. Then he opened the communication requesting the federal Title III wiretap addressed to a federal magistrate in Atlanta who had no connection to Caldwell County and no reason to protect anyone in it. He attached the probable cause documentation, the financial records, the stop data, the inconsistencies in the case files, the buffer recording from the patrol car, and he sent it at 11:57 at night. The authorization came back at 2:41 in the morning. By dawn, Mercer's personal phone and the landline at Dale Jr.'s impound lot were being monitored. By noon on the day of the arraignment, what had been discomfort in Colt Mercer's chest had graduated into something that he did not have a precise word for, but that sat behind his sternum and would not leave. Regardless of the coffee he drank, or the drive he took, or the conversation he had with Taft in the cruiser about how the FBI guy was probably bluffing, probably doing nothing, probably just rattled because his old man got what he deserved. Taft said all the right things, and Mercer heard none of them, as he was intended to hear them, because somewhere beneath the layers of ego and entitlement and 18 years of operating without consequence, the animal part of Mercer's intelligence, the part that was not a bully or a landlord or the son of a well-connected sheriff, but simply a man who had done bad things and needed to stay free, had picked up a scent that was fundamentally different from anything he had smelled before. He called his brother-in-law, Dale Jr., was cautious on the phone in a way that he was never cautious in person, which told Mercer something. He called Judge Platt. Platt's assistant said he was unavailable and would return calls in order, which told Mercer a great deal more. He drove to the impound lot at 4 in the afternoon and waited in Dale Jr.'s office with the engine running for 40 minutes before Platt arrived, which he did in his personal car rather than his county vehicle, and without the usual composed authority of a man entering a room he owns. Platt was wearing his good suit and his tie was still on, but it was loose, and there was a particular quality to his movements, quick, slightly unfocused, that Mercer recognized from seeing it in other men over the years, usually in interrogation rooms, always in men who had just been presented with information that contradicted the version of events they had planned to rely on. "Do you know who that man is?" Platt said before he had fully closed the office door. "I know who he says he is," Mercer said. "I had my clerk check." Platt sat down across from Dale Jr.'s desk with the manner of a man lowering himself onto something he's not sure will hold him. His name is in the federal system. He's not just an Agent Colt. He's the primary investigator on the Meridian case. Neither Mercer nor Dale Jr. knew the details of the Meridian case, but the name had been in the state papers 18 months ago, and they had both read enough of those articles to know that the Meridian case had involved the FBI dismantling a multi-county corruption network that had involved elected officials, county employees, and law enforcement personnel, and had resulted in 11 federal convictions. "He's one man," Mercer said. "He's one man with the Department of Justice behind him," Platt said. "And Colt, he's already subpoenaed your patrol car's server records. My clerk in records got the notification this morning. If he pulls the buffer from the dash camera..." The dash cam was off. The buffer was not off. Platt's voice had taken on a quality that Mercer had not heard from the judge before. Something fractured in it. Something that was working to maintain its authority over material that kept trying to escape it. There is apparently a 90-second buffer recording that captures automatically regardless of whether the camera is manually disabled. If he has that recording, he said he has it. Dale Jr. said quietly. He had been sitting behind his desk looking at his hands. He said it in the courtroom. The silence in the office was the particular silence of men who have collectively run out of the kind of reassurances they have been offering each other for years and found that the supply was finite after all. It was Mercer who broke it. He stood up, and in the set of his shoulders and the quality of his eyes, there was something that Platt would later describe in a federal interview room as the look of a man who had decided that the only way out was through something worse than what had gotten him there in the first place. "We discredit the old man," Mercer said. "We say he wasn't just walking a mail route for 40 years. We say he was moving product. The reason he gave me lip about his rights was because he was dirty." Platt looked at him. "His son is FBI. His son being FBI doesn't make the old man a saint. We raid the house. We find something. Then the son backs off, or his daddy spends what's left of his life being a federally charged drug mule." The room absorbed this. Dale Jr. looked at the wall. Platt looked at Mercer. And then Platt, who had been on the bench for 22 years and who had signed many things in those years that he had not looked at too carefully, who had dismissed many complaints and extended many courtesies and maintained many friendships that served him well and whose ultimate purpose he had never fully examined because examination was not a habit he had cultivated, looked at the judge who had once been a man before he was the office, and the man inside the office was very frightened. "Do it," Platt said. "Get a warrant. I'll sign it tonight. Predate it to yesterday." Mercer pulled a vacuum-sealed bag from the inside of his tactical vest. Compact heavy, a kilo of cocaine that had come off a Route 11 stop 8 months ago and had never been logged into evidence, and laid it on Dale Jr.'s desk. "Gear up," Mercer said to Dale Jr. "I'll call Taft. We're going hunting." 2 miles away, in a plain panel van with a magnetic sign on the side reading Caldwell HVAC Services, a digital recorder spun silently in the dark. Marcus had been listening since 4 in the afternoon. The Title III authorization had been executed before dawn, and by mid-morning the Bureau's technical unit had a clean feed from Mercer's personal cell phone and from the landline at Dale Jr.'s lot. The phone feeds had yielded useful material throughout the day: a call between Mercer and Dale Jr. at 11 that morning, a call between Mercer and a sergeant at the department at 1, and finally the call to Judge Platt's private line at 3:30, which had been the most informative of all. But the best material came from the impound lot office itself. This was the work of a surveillance technician named Chen, who had driven down from Atlanta before Marcus, arriving in Caldwell County at 7 in the morning, wearing work clothes and carrying a toolbox, and who had gained access to Dale Jr.'s office at 9:45 by the simple mechanism of calling ahead to say he was from the county's HVAC contractor and needed to check the office unit before the afternoon heat. Dale Jr., who had been distracted and whose brain had not been operating with its full capacity since the previous afternoon's events, had told him the office was unlocked. Chen had installed a listening device in the smoke detector above the desk in 22 seconds. The smoke detector had been there since 2018. No one had ever changed its battery. Marcus sat in the van with headphones on and listened to the meeting. He listened to Platt describe the Meridian case. He listened to Mercer's voice take on the particular quality it took on when he was performing confidence rather than feeling it. He listened to the plan coalesce. The raid, the plant, the predated warrant, and he listened to Platt say, "Do it," in the quiet, defeated voice of a man who has been walking toward this moment for 20 years without admitting it. When the meeting ended and the office emptied out, Marcus removed the headphones and sat in the silence of the van for a long moment. Then he reached for his secure radio. He called Atlanta. He requested an 8-agent tactical unit, 2 forensic accountants, and a representative from the U.S. Attorney's Southeastern Office. He told them to stage at a rest stop on Highway 19, 1 mile outside the Caldwell County line, and to wait for his signal. He called the surveillance technician and told him to prepare the kit for the house on Beaumont Lane. Then he drove to his father's house and sat at the kitchen table and told Elroy exactly what was coming and exactly what he needed him to do. He explained the pinhole cameras, 3 in the living room. Bookshelves, 1 in the frame of the grandfather clock in the corner, 1 in the vent cover above the front door. He explained the microphones embedded in the doilies on the end tables. He explained where the tactical team would be positioned and at what point they would enter. He told his father to sit in his wingback chair, to keep his hands where they could be seen, to let Mercer do what he came to do. Elroy listened to all of it. When Marcus finished, Elroy sat quietly for a moment, the prayer card from Clara's hospital stay in the breast pocket of his flannel pajamas, exactly where he had kept it since the holding cell. "You're sure they'll come tonight?" Elroy said. "A man doesn't throw his whole life away over a traffic stop," Marcus said. "It's not about the stop anymore, Dad. It's about the fact that you saw his face. You saw the crack in the mask. Mercer's a narcissist with a badge. To him, you aren't a person. You're a thread that could pull the whole thing apart. He thinks he's coming here to bury a problem. He doesn't realize he's walking into the end of his own story." Elroy looked at his son. "Be careful." "I will." "That's not enough," Elroy said. "Come home." Marcus looked at his father's face, the bruise, the prayer card in the breast pocket, the particular stillness of a man who has understood the dimensions of a situation and accepted them. He thought briefly and involuntarily about the photograph in the glove box, the postal uniform, the 9-year-old squinting into the sun. "I'll come home," he said. The last of September's heat had broken by midnight, and the air over Beaumont Lane carried the first true suggestion of fall in it. The smell of cooling earth and dried leaves, and the particular cleanness of Georgia nights when the humidity finally releases its hold. The porch lights of the houses on the lane made small yellow circles on the sidewalk, and in the deeper dark between the trees at the far end of the block, shapes that a casual observer would have identified as shadows did not move. The way shadows move. There were 11 federal agents positioned around the property, 3 in the crawl space beneath the neighboring garage, 2 in the tree line along the back fence, 2 on the roof of the structure behind the carport, 4 more in vehicles on the connecting street to the east. All of them had been in position since sunset. All of them were still. The blacked-out Sheriff's Department SUV came down Beaumont Lane at 12:43, with no lights and no radio moving at a speed calibrated to be just fast enough to reach the objective and just slow enough not to attract attention. It stopped at the far end of the block. 3 doors opened and closed with the particular quiet of men who have done this before and know the value of sound discipline. Colt Mercer stood on the wet asphalt and looked at the house. The porch light was on. It was always on. He had driven past this house before, not many times, but enough to know its geography enough to know which windows faced the street and where the front door was and where the corner of the porch wrapped around to the side. He had never paid attention to who lived there because he had never needed to. Now the house at the end of Beaumont Lane was the last obstacle between him and the continuation of everything he had built. Beside him, Deputy Robbie Taft adjusted the straps of his tactical vest with the practiced motion of a man who knows how gear should sit. On Mercer's other side was Deputy Gene Cruz 31, who had been with the department for 3 years and who had been told that this was a high-risk narcotics warrant on a known trafficking address, and who had the expression of a man who had decided to believe what he had been told. All 3 of them wore tactical vests. Taft and Cruz had balaclavas pulled up to their chins, ready to be pulled over their faces. Mercer's face was uncovered. He wanted Elroy to see him. He needed the old man to understand in the moment when the door came off and the light hit his face that this was Colt Mercer, that Colt Mercer owned this county, and that correcting a deputy on the shoulder of Route 11 had a price that a 74-year-old retired mailman was going to spend the rest of his life paying. "Remember," Mercer said, his voice barely above a whisper, "high-risk narcotics warrant. If the old man reaches for anything, TV, remote phone, anything, you treat it as a threat. Priority is the plant. I go in, I secure the suspect, I put the package in the chair. You 2 clear the back. If the Fed's son is in there, you detain him for obstruction." Taft nodded. Cruz said, "What if the FBI agent draws?" Mercer patted the holster on his thigh. "Then he's a threat to officer safety," he said. "We have a signed warrant from a county judge. We have the high ground." He pulled the breaching ram from the SUV's cargo area, hefted it, felt its weight and its purpose. They moved up the walkway in a staggered line, Mercer at the point, the other 2 behind and to the sides, their weapon lights off until they needed them. The wooden planks of the porch took their weight one by one. Slowly, the old boards managing their silence the way old boards do, imperfectly, with small protests that Mercer told himself no one would hear. He raised the breaching ram. He did not knock. He did not announce. The ram connected with the door frame at the lock plate with the concentrated force of 220 pounds of man and momentum behind it, and the deadbolt did not give it disintegrated. The door swung inward hard, the frame splintering, and the 3 men went through it with their weapon lights blazing. The lights cut through the living room in sweeping arcs, bouncing off books and photographs, and the face of the grandfather clock in the corner, and the framed picture of a woman on the mantel, and the wing-back chair against the far wall, where Elroy Beaumont sat with his hands raised, his eyes squinting against the glare, his breathing shallow but controlled. "Don't move!" Mercer screamed, his Glock coming up and leveling at Elroy's chest. Hands in the air. "Don't move! Don't touch anything!" "I'm not moving," Elroy said. His voice was exactly the voice he had used on the shoulder of Route 11. Quiet, clear, truthful. His hands were up. His face was still. "I'm sitting in my chair. We have a warrant for these premises," Mercer said, moving into the room. "We have credible intelligence of a narcotics distribution operation in this house." "I've lived here 40 years, Elroy said. "I've never had a parking ticket." Mercer signaled to Taft and Cruz. They disappeared down the hallway toward the back of the house, their boots heavy on the floorboards. Mercer crossed the room. He stood over Elroy. He was close enough that Elroy could smell the cigarettes, and the night air on him could see the particular quality of Mercer's eyes, the alive, predatory quality that belonged to a man who has decided to do something and is in this moment doing it. Mercer reached into the cargo pocket of his tactical pants and produced the vacuum-sealed package. He held it at chest height for a moment, looking at the old man below him. Looking at the bruise on Elroy's cheek, his own work from the previous afternoon with something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite regret, and was in the end neither simply the indifference of a man who has categorized another human being as a problem to be managed. "You should have just taken the ticket," Elroy Mercer said. His voice was quiet now, almost gentle, the way voices go quiet when they believe they have won. "You should have kept your head down and your mouth shut and driven home to your pharmacy bag and your porch light and your tomato garden, and let me go on about my business." He leaned in. "Men like you forget your place. I'm just here to remind you of it." He shoved the vacuum-sealed package into the side of the wingback chair, deep into the gap between the cushion and the frame, pressing it down with practiced efficiency. Then he keyed his radio to make the discovery official. "Is that it?" "Colt?" The voice was level, unhurried, and came from the darkened kitchen doorway. Mercer spun. His weapon light swung across the room and landed on Marcus Beaumont, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed over his chest and his expression containing something that was not quite satisfaction and was something considerably colder. The expression of a man watching something he has been building for a long time arrive at the moment he built it toward. Washington, Mercer said. "He used the wrong name and he didn't know it." "Get on the ground. You are interfering with a felony investigation." "I'm not interfering with anything," Marcus said. I'm observing a Caldwell County deputy planting a controlled substance in a private residence. I'm observing a violation of the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments. I'm observing a man who has been recorded on 6 separate devices in this room, in addition to the living room audio from which I heard every word he said to my father. He stepped forward into the edge of the weapon light's reach. He was still in the charcoal suit. He had not loosened the tie. "I found it in the chair," Mercer said when it's new. His voice was rising in pitch in the specific way voices rise when what they are saying has become completely disconnected from what is true. "I have witnesses. Taft and Cruz can confirm." From the back of the house came 2 sounds in rapid succession, muffled impacts, brief and professional, followed by the distinctive plastic-on-plastic sound of flex cuffs being ratcheted tight. "They won't answer you," Marcus said. "They're currently being detained by members of the FBI's tactical unit who have been positioned throughout and around this property since sunset." He paused. "I didn't come alone, Colt. I brought a fair number of friends. They've been in the crawl space, the tree line, and the neighbor's roof since approximately 8:30 this evening. The lights came first. Not flashlight beams, but the broad, comprehensive illumination of tactical beacons deployed outside the windows, turning the night beyond the glass from dark to blinding white. Then, the figures visible in every window, simultaneously multi-directional, the particular geometry of a professional containment. The front door, already broken, framed 3 agents in tactical gear with rifles at the low ready and FBI in yellow letters on their vests. FBI. "Drop the weapon." The command came from multiple directions at the same time. The red dots of laser sights appeared on Mercer's chest, 1, then 2, then 4, blooming like terrible flowers against the fabric of his tactical vest. Mercer's hand held the gun for 3 more seconds. He looked at the lasers. He looked at Marcus, who had not moved, had not reached for a weapon, had not changed his expression. He looked at his father's chair where the package was wedged into the cushion. He looked at Elroy, who had lowered his hands now and was sitting forward in the chair, his elbows on his knees, his face profoundly tired. The gun hit the carpet. Marcus walked across the room. He took Mercer by the front of the vest with one hand, not violently, not with the kind of force Mercer had used on Elroy, and turned him around with the efficient, practiced motion of a man who has done this in rooms considerably more dangerous than a living room in Caldwell County. The handcuffs came out of Marcus's jacket pocket and closed around Mercer's wrists with the clean double click of a federal arrest. Marcus leaned close. He spoke quietly enough that only Mercer could hear it. "I found Darnell Oakes's file last night," Marcus said. "And Terrell Mosley's. And Jerome Banks, he was 20 years old, Colt. He's been in a state facility for 7 years on evidence that came out of your trunk." He paused. "The Bureau is going to go through every stop you've made in the last decade. Every arrest. Every case where the evidence originated from your patrol car or your initiative. We're going to find every single person you did this to, and we're going to give them a new hearing. And you're going to be here to watch it happen." Mercer said nothing. The agents came in and took him by the arms. The red and blue lights of the FBI vehicles lit the houses of Beaumont Lane in their flickering alternation, and on their porches, in their doorways, in the windows facing the street, the neighbors of Elroy Beaumont watched the Caldwell County Sheriff's deputies being walked out of the old man's house in federal custody. Loretta next door was on her porch with her hand over her mouth. The family 2 doors down had come out onto their steps, the parents in front, a small child peering around from behind. No one was celebrating. There was no noise. It was the particular silence of people who have been waiting without fully knowing they were waiting for a version of events in which this county worked the way it was supposed to work, and who find in the moment when it arrives that the feeling is not exactly joy, but something quieter and deeper, the specific relief of having the ground under your feet confirmed as solid after a long period of not being entirely certain. Marcus stood in the doorway of the shattered front door and watched Mercer, Taft, and Cruz be placed in separate federal vehicles. Taft's face was blank in the way of a man who has not yet fully understood the shape of what has happened to him. Cruz looked ill. Mercer looked straight ahead at nothing, or rather, he looked at the middle distance where nothing currently was the particular gaze of a man whose entire framework for understanding his own position in the world has just been invalidated and who has not yet found anything to replace it. Marcus stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he turned back into the house. Elroy was still in the wingback chair. He had not moved. The agents moving through the room gave him a wide berth. One of them, a young woman with her dark hair pulled back under a tactical helmet, had quietly moved a glass of water from the kitchen to the end table beside him, without being asked, and Elroy had thanked her, in the same tone he had thanked Donna the nurse that morning, and she had nodded and gone back to work. Marcus crossed to his father. He reached out and straightened the collar of Elroy's flannel robe, the same motion from the same instinct as the gesture Elroy had made 10,000 times with Marcus's school jacket and his church shirt, and the collar of the postal uniform he had worn on the day of the photograph, and the recognition of the reversal passed between them without either of them naming it. "You okay, Pop?" Elroy looked at the shattered front door, the daylight of the FBI vehicles visible through it, the splinters of the doorframe still on the floor. The ordinary house with its books and its photograph of Clara and its eucalyptus sachets disrupted by this extraordinary night. And then he looked back at his son. "I'm fine," he said. He reached into his breast pocket and held the prayer card between 2 fingers for a moment, just holding it, not reading it. Then he said, "I kept thinking about all the men who don't have a son like you. All the men sitting in a cell right now, with their medication in an impound lot, without anyone who can walk through those doors." Marcus sat on the arm of the chair beside his father. The agents moved around them. Outside, the Beaumont Lane neighborhood slowly settled back into its version of the night. Inside, in the wingback chair beside the mantel where Clara's photograph watched over everything, with her patient, permanent attention, a 74-year-old man held a small, laminated card with his late wife's handwriting on the back, and his son sat beside him, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence was not empty. It was not quite 6 in the morning when the convoy of black federal vehicles moved down Jefferson Avenue in Caldwell County's small downtown, and the overnight workers at the gas station on the corner and the man unlocking the feed store on the west end of the block watched them pass with the particular alertness of people who understand from the sheer density of purpose in a thing's movement that something significant is occurring and that the county will be different by the time the day is done. The vehicles split at the intersection of Jefferson and Courthouse Square. The first Unit 2 vehicles, 4 agents, continued to the courthouse where Judge Warren Platt was arrested at 7:14 in the morning in his office before the first case of the day's docket was called. He was in his robes. His bailiff stood against the wall with his hands at his sides and did not interfere. Platt himself, when presented with the federal warrant, seemed to have expected it, or rather seemed to have reached the point of exhausted relief that some people reach when a thing they have been dreading finally arrives and can therefore be addressed. The second unit went to Dale's Towing and Recovery on County Road 18. Dale Mercer, Jr. was already at the lot when they arrived, standing beside one of the flatbed trucks with a cup of coffee in one hand and a phone in the other. And when he saw the federal vehicles come through the gate, he set the coffee down on the truck's running board with a very particular carefulness, the carefulness of someone who is trying very hard to maintain composure while all the structures they have spent years building dissolve around them. He surrendered without incident, hands up, keys on the hood of the nearest vehicle. Tears running down his face in a way that appeared to embarrass him deeply, and that he made no attempt to stop. The third unit went to the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department where Marcus's supervisor, Senior Agent Patricia Huang, arrived with 2 internal affairs investigators from the state capitol and formally served the consent decree that placed the department's operations under federal oversight. The acting sheriff, a lieutenant named Garver, who had been 3 weeks away from retirement and who had spent the morning drinking very bad coffee and staring at the ceiling of his office, accepted the documentation with a silence that spoke of a man who had seen enough of what the department had been to understand that what was happening was not an injustice, but its opposite. Marcus was in the community center on Wren Street by 8 in the morning, overseeing the assembly of a command center that occupied the main meeting room and smelled of dry erase markers and coffee, and the particular concentration of people doing important work in a small space. The walls filled with documentation, the stop records, the financial trail. The case files for Darnell Oakes and Terrell Mosley and Jerome Banks, the organizational chart of the Mercer operation, rendered in the clear-eyed, comprehensive style of federal analysis. Beside the financial section of the wall was the name Pruitt, Kyle Pruitt. The 23-year-old rookie had driven to the community center at 7:45 that morning in his personal vehicle, not his cruiser, wearing his own clothes. He had asked for Marcus at the front desk. He had been shown to a room where he sat down across from Agent Huang and opened a notebook he had been keeping since his 3rd week on the job, dates, incidents, vehicle numbers, what he had seen and what he had been told to overlook, and he had begun talking. Marcus spent 45 minutes with Pruitt at mid-morning. He found a young man who was not trying to minimize what he had failed to do or to present himself as more heroic than he had been. He said plainly that he had been afraid and that fear had made him complicit, and that he understood now what complicity cost the people it was extracted from. "You came in on your own," Marcus said. "That's not enough to make up for what I didn't do," Pruitt said. "No," Marcus agreed, "but it's a start." He looked at the young man for a moment. The first person in a corrupt room who decides to see clearly is the most important person in that room. Not the hero, not the whistleblower, Just the person who decides to see what's actually there. He paused. You're going to testify to everything in that notebook. All of it. And when it's done, you're going to have to decide what kind of law enforcement officer you want to be for the rest of your career. Today is the decision. Pruitt nodded. He kept his eyes steady. The temporary interrogation room was a converted storage closet at the back of the community center, cleaned out and furnished with 2 folding chairs and a metal table and a light fixture that worked correctly, which was better than could be said for the county jail's equivalent. It smelled of cleaning solution and new carpet, and the particular neutrality of a space that has been made ready for something important. Marcus sat across from Judge Warren Platt at 9:30 in the morning with a single document on the table between them, the transcript of the impound lot, recording 22 pages of clean text in 12-point font. Every word that had been spoken in that office the previous evening, printed out in the order, it had been spoken with the timestamps visible in the right margin. Platt had not yet seen a lawyer. He had been told he could call one, and he had said he would. And then he had sat for an hour with the document in front of him and not called one, which was the decision of a man who had already, somewhere in the preceding hours, understood that the lawyer would not change what was in the document. The judge looked in the folding chair across from Marcus. Nothing like the man who had occupied the bench at the Caldwell County Municipal Court for 22 years. The robe was gone. The bench was gone. Without the elevation and the costume and the gavel's authority, Warren Platt was a 63-year-old man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a silk tie that he had not been able to bring himself to remove because it was one of the last vestiges of the identity he had been wearing when he walked out of his office in handcuffs that morning. He tried the victim narrative. He said Mercer had coerced him, that the operation had been Mercer's invention, that Platt had been put in an impossible position. Marcus let him finish. Then he laid 3 additional documents on the table. The LLC filing with Platt's signature as a registered beneficial owner. The routing records for the impound revenue and the sentencing records for 3 defendants, whose trials Platt had presided over, men convicted on evidence from Mercer's patrol car, who had received sentences at the high end of the guidelines, whose convictions had contributed to the credibility of Mercer's operation by confirming through official judicial findings that the men Mercer was arresting were in fact guilty. You didn't just sign warrants, Marcus said. You authenticated what he did. Every guilty verdict you handed down on a case that originated with Mercer told the county that the system was working. You were the part of the machine that made the machine look legitimate. Platt looked at the documents. His hands were on the table flat, the way hands go when their owner has stopped needing them to perform anything. What do you want? Platt said. The full truth, Marcus said. Everything. The commissioners, the state representative, the arrangement with the county lab, the properties, every dollar and every name. He stood. You'll get the offer in writing when the U.S. Attorney's Office is ready to make it. Until then, you should think about the fact that the families of 3 men who are currently in state prison on evidence you helped sanitize are going to be told about this prosecution this afternoon. Think about what those families are entitled to. He left the room. Mercer's cell was at the far end of the holding wing that the federal unit had established in the back of the county building, and Marcus walked to it at 11 in the morning with no file, no document, no tablet, nothing but himself. He stood at the bars and looked at the man on the cot on the other side. Mercer was sitting with his back against the wall, his knees up, his arms resting on them, with the particular posture of a man who is occupying a small space and has decided that the best response to its smallness is to take up as much of it as possible. The buzz cut was still uneven. The jaw was no longer working gum. His eyes, when he looked up at Marcus, had lost the flat, predatory quality that had been their defining characteristic for as long as anyone in Caldwell County had known Colt Mercer. What was in them now was not simple fear. Fear was too easily named, but something more fundamental, the particular disorientation of a man who has operated his entire adult life according to a set of rules that he assumed were the permanent structure of reality, and who has just discovered that the rules were local and contingent, and had in the end depended entirely on no one who could do anything about them, ever deciding to do anything about them. Marcus looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then he said quietly, "I found Elroy's medication last night, the white pharmacy bag with his name on the prescription label. It was still on the passenger seat of the Buick. Your brother-in-law's lot had the car for 19 hours. The bag was on the seat unopened exactly where my father left it." Mercer did not respond. 19 hours, Marcus said. "Sit with that." He turned and walked back down the hall. The grand jury met in Atlanta in the federal courthouse on Spring Street, and it met in the normal way of federal grand juries, without ceremony, without audience, in the clean, procedural quiet of a room where the question being addressed was not whether something had happened, but whether there was sufficient probable cause to proceed to a trial at which the full determination would be made. The answer in the case of Colt Mercer, Judge Warren Platt Dale Mercer, Jr. Deputy Robbie Taft. Deputy Gene Cruz and 6 additional defendants, including 2 Caldwell County commissioners and a state representative whose names had been provided by Platt in the hours following his interrogation, was provided in 31 indictments returned on a Thursday morning. The charges ranged across racketeering, conspiracy, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, evidence tampering, and kidnapping, the last charge applying to the 3 stops in which Mercer had arrested drivers on fabricated charges and transported them to the county jail, with planted evidence used to sustain the arrest. Marcus was in Atlanta when the indictments came through in the U.S. Attorney's office conference room with his supervisor and the lead prosecuting attorney, who was a woman named Dana Reeves with 20 years in federal civil rights prosecution and a reputation for building cases so thoroughly that by the time they reached trial, the defense's primary task was damage limitation rather than acquittal. She had been reviewing the Operation Landlord file for 4 days and had told Marcus on the second day that in her 20 years she had rarely seen a case assembled with this level of completeness, and that whoever had built it was, in her professional assessment, exceptionally good at their job. Marcus had thanked her and asked when they could begin coordinating the new hearings for Oaks, Mosley, and Banks. Simultaneously with the indictments, Reeves said, "I've already contacted the State Attorney General's office. The new hearings will be expedited. Given the chain of custody issues with the original evidence, given that the source of that evidence is now a federal defendant, the standard for reversal is met before we even get to the specifics of each case." The consent decree on the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department was formalized that same week. State police assumed operational control. Every body camera in the department was replaced with a new model that uploaded to a federally monitored cloud server in real time, and every new officer hired under the reconstituted department would be required to complete a 20-hour civil rights training program developed by the Justice Department's Community-Oriented Policing Services Office. The existing leadership of the department, what remained of it after the arrests, was placed under the direct supervision of a federal monitor who reported quarterly to the U.S. Attorney's Southeastern Division. Marcus drove back to Caldwell on a Friday evening, and the house on Beaumont Lane had its porch light on, and Elroy was in the kitchen making dinner, and the tomatoes in the back garden that had been browning at the edges had been cut back and covered in anticipation of the first real frost, and the Buick LeSabre was in the driveway, washed and polished. They ate dinner together at the kitchen table, and Elroy told a story about a woman on his old postal route who had kept 3 large dogs that had, for the first 6 months, regarded him as a personal affront, and how by the end of the 3rd year, the largest of the 3 had taken to meeting him at the gate every Tuesday, and Marcus laughed and Elroy laughed, and the lamp over the table made the kitchen small and warm against the first cool night of the Georgia fall, and the letter informing Elroy that all charges against him had been dismissed with prejudice was folded on the counter where Marcus had left it after reading it aloud that afternoon. In the living room, Clara watched from her photograph on the mantel, patient and permanent. The federal courthouse in Atlanta was a building that existed entirely outside the aesthetic of Caldwell County. It was glass and marble, and the particular confident permanence of federal architecture, cool in all temperatures, precisely lit, smelling of floor wax, and the institutional gravity of a place where the full weight of the law's machinery is in continuous operation. It was 6 stories above the street where ordinary life moved, and from the gallery windows on the 2nd floor where the courtroom was located, you could see the skyline and the traffic, and the ordinary, unremarkable motion of a city going about its business, indifferent to what was being decided inside. The gallery was full every day of the 12-day trial. In the 4th row, the 3 families, the Oakes family, the Mosley family, the Banks family, sat together as they had arranged to do after meeting for the first time in the courthouse cafeteria on the first morning. They did not speak much during the proceedings. They sat and they watched and they listened with the particular contained attention of people who have been waiting for something for years and understand that the waiting is nearly over, but that the watching still requires all of them. The prosecution, led by Dana Reeves, opened with the stop data, 340 stops, the racial breakdown presented as a graph that the jury could see in full on the monitors mounted on the courtroom walls. She let the graph speak for approximately 30 seconds before she began to explain it, which was exactly the right amount of time for a jury to absorb the shape of what they were looking at and to form independently the question that the prosecution was going to spend 12 days answering. The break room recording came in on the 4th day. Reeves played it in full 4 minutes and 18 seconds of Colt Mercer, describing the previous afternoon's stop to Taft and a mostly silent Pruitt, including the performance of Elroy's careful voice, the mockery of the medication request, and the final line about men like Elroy forgetting their place and needing to be reminded of it. She let it run without interruption. When it ended, the courtroom was silent in the particular way that courtrooms go silent, when a piece of evidence has done everything it needed to do, and the room is processing the result. Kyle Pruitt testified on the 6th day. He had been prepared by Reeves over 4 sessions that he had described to Marcus as the 4 hardest conversations of his life, harder even than the conversations with his mother, who had cried when he called to tell her what he was doing. He sat in the witness box in civilian clothes. He had resigned from the department the week after the arrests, and he spoke for 3 hours with the careful, precise composure of a man who has decided that if he is going to do a difficult thing, he is going to do it completely. He described every stop he had been present for. He described the moments he had looked away. He described the specific texture of the silence that Taft and the rest of them had maintained around Mercer's operations, not a silence that required agreement, just a silence that required the absence of objection, which was, he had come to understand, its own form of agreement. He was cross-examined for 40 minutes by Mercer's attorney, who attempted the standard approach of casting Pruitt as a man seeking leniency through cooperation, which was factually accurate but procedurally incomplete. Pruitt had received no deal. He had resigned his position and was cooperating without any formal agreement in place, which Reeves had established in her direct examination and which the jury had heard clearly. Mercer's attorney did not recover from this. Marcus took the stand on the 9th day. He came in the same charcoal suit he had worn to the arraignment, and he moved to the witness box with the quiet assurance of a man who has been in courtrooms many times and regards them as places where work gets done. The prosecution's questions were straightforward, and his answers were precise and specific and devoid of any performance of emotion, which made the single moment when the answer changed in character considerably more powerful. Reeves asked him to describe what he had found when he arrived at the Caldwell County Jail on the evening of September's last Tuesday. Marcus looked at the jury, not at Reeves, not at the bench, but at the 12 people who had been listening for 9 days to the accumulated evidence of what Colt Mercer had done in this county for 18 years. My father's blood pressure medication, he said, was still on the passenger seat of his impounded vehicle. The white paper pharmacy bag with his name on the prescription label, unopened. After 19 hours. He let that sit. That's what I found, he said. The jury returned in 4 hours and 13 minutes. The foreman, a man in his late 50s who had driven a delivery route in Fulton County for 23 years and who had in the course of those 23 years developed opinions about the relationship between a man and his route and the dignity inherent in honest work, stood and read the verdict in a voice that was steady and clear and carried to every corner of the room. Guilty on all 23 counts. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after the verdict, and in those 3 weeks, the families of Darnell Oaks and Terrell Mosley and Jerome Banks attended their husbands' and fathers' and sons' new hearings in Georgia State Court. And in all 3 cases, the vacatur of the original convictions was granted on the grounds that the integrity of the evidence chain had been irrevocably compromised by the federal conviction of the arresting officer, and all 3 men were freed. Marcus was in the gallery for all 3 hearings. Elroy attended the 3rd Jerome Banks's hearing, the youngest of the 3, the man who had been 20 years old when Mercer arrested him, and who was 27 now, with 7 years of his life spent in a state facility for a crime he had not committed. When Banks walked out of the courtroom with his family, Elroy stood, and Banks's mother looked across the gallery and found the old man's face among the others, and something passed between them. In that look, the recognition of people who have been on different ends of the same story and who understand, without needing to name it, what connects them. The federal sentencing hearing for Colt Mercer, Warren Platt, and Dale Mercer Jr. convened in the same Atlanta courthouse on a Wednesday morning in November, when the trees outside had gone gold and the light came through the courthouse windows at a low northern angle that made everything inside the room look slightly more serious than it would have looked in summer. The presiding judge was the Honorable Adrienne Cole. She was 58 years old, had been a public defender for 10 years before joining the federal bench, and was known professionally for 2 qualities that made her exceptionally difficult to appear before. If you were a defendant in a civil rights violation case, she had read everything in the file and she remembered everything she had read. She looked at Colt Mercer across the courtroom for a long moment before she began. Mercer stood at the defense table in a Navy federal issue suit that did not fit him well. He had lost weight in the month since the arrest, not dramatically, but enough that the suit hung on him in a way that emphasized the absence of the uniform that had been his armor for 18 years. The swagger was gone with the same finality that it had left the impound lot office the night of the raid, and what remained was a man of 44 who looked in the fluorescent light of the federal courtroom approximately 10 years older than that. In the front row of the gallery, Elroy Beaumont sat in the same pew where Darnell Oaks's family and Terrell Mosley's family and Jerome Banks's family sat together on the first 3 days of the trial. He wore his best Sunday suit, the dark gray one he reserved for occasions that warranted it, and his posture was straight, and his hands were folded in his lap, and his face was quiet in the way of a man who has arrived at the end of a long road and is not celebrating arrival but is simply honestly present. Beside him, in his own charcoal suit, Marcus sat with his hands on his knees and watched his father and thought about nothing in particular, which was for a man who had spent 14 months building a federal case and then 3 months executing it, an almost unprecedented experience. Judge Cole began. "Colt Mercer," she said. Her voice filled the room without effort, not loud, not theatrical, simply adequate to the space and to the occasion. "You have been convicted by a jury of your peers on 23 federal counts, including racketeering, conspiracy, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, evidence tampering, and kidnapping. The trial record is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of sustained deliberate abuse of law enforcement authority that I have reviewed in 17 years on this bench." She looked at the papers on the bench. She looked back at Mercer. "You were given a badge. You were given a gun. You were given the trust of the people of Caldwell County, which is a small community of working people, postal workers and farmers and teachers and mechanics who did not choose you, who did not elect you, who simply understood that the person wearing that badge had agreed in the clearest possible public terms to protect them. That is the agreement. That has always been the agreement." Mercer looked at the defense table. He had been looking at the defense table for most of the morning. Instead, you treated the roads of that county as a hunting ground. You targeted drivers based on the color of their skin. You stole from them. You imprisoned men on evidence you manufactured with your own hands. You attempted to imprison a 74-year-old man, a man who had spent nearly 4 decades delivering mail to the residents of Caldwell County in all weather, a man who had never once been charged with any offense because he corrected a factual error you made during an illegal stop. She paused. The courtroom was very still. You did all of this because no one stopped you. For 18 years, the structures around you, internal affairs, the bench, the county administration, chose not to look. That failure belongs to those structures as much as the crimes belong to you, and this court intends to address those structures as thoroughly as it addresses you. She looked at her papers. But the man before this court today is you, Colt Mercer. And the sentence this court imposes reflects not only the crimes for which you were convicted, but the duration and the deliberateness with which you committed them, and the number of human lives you altered and in some cases destroyed in the process. She set down the sentencing papers. On the composite federal charges, including the racketeering, civil rights, evidence tampering, and kidnapping counts, I sentence you to 34 years in a federal correctional facility without the possibility of parole. Your pension and all law enforcement benefits are permanently forfeited. All revenue identified as derived from the impound operation is subject to civil forfeiture, the proceeds of which will be applied to restitution for the victims identified in this proceeding and their families. She raised the gavel. The court thanks the jury and thanks the citizens who came forward to testify in this matter. The value of what was done here goes beyond this courtroom. This is what the law is supposed to look like. The gavel came down. In the gallery, no one cheered. The families held each other. Loretta Simmons, who had driven up from Caldwell for the day, pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. Pruitt, sitting in the back row in his civilian clothes, looked at his hands and breathed. Platt received 28 years. Dale Mercer Jr. received 12. The commissioners received 8 years each. The state representative received with the reduced sentence reflecting his cooperation. The structure was, as of that Wednesday morning in November, completely dismantled. As the federal marshals came for Mercer, they crossed in front of the gallery to reach the side door. The route took them within 10 feet of the front row. Mercer walked between the marshals with his hands in front of him, his eyes on the floor, and then at the point closest to where Elroy sat. Something made him look up. He and Elroy met eyes. The old man did not look away. He did not harden his expression or sharpen it or put anything into it that was not already there. What was there was the same thing that had been there on the shoulder of Route 11 when Mercer had told him to step out of the car, the same thing that had been there in the holding cell and in the courtroom and in the wingback chair, while Mercer crouched over him with a brick of cocaine in his hand. It was the particular stillness of a man who has lived his 74 years with his integrity intact and who does not require the acknowledgement or the capitulation of the person across from him because he does not need anything from that person. He is complete without it. Mercer held the look for perhaps 3 seconds. Then his eyes dropped. His head bowed slightly, and without his choosing it. The marshals walked him through the side door. The sun was different in December than it had been in September, lower, more direct, the Georgia light coming in at an angle that put long shadows on the courthouse steps by mid-afternoon and made the cold feel colder than the thermometer suggested. Darnell Oaks walked out of the state courthouse with his wife and his teenage daughter on either side of him, and he walked the way a man walks who has not walked free in 7 years carefully, with attention to the feel of the ground, as if he is relearning a relationship with it that should be automatic but has temporarily become something that requires conscious effort. Marcus was in the gallery for all 3 exoneration hearings as he had been for the sentencing. He wore his badge on his belt and his suit, and he sat in the same place each time. Middle of the gallery, left side, close to the aisle, and he watched the proceedings with the same focused attention he brought to everything, but without the professional distance that his work usually required, because this was not work. This was the thing the work had been for. Elroy attended Jerome Banks's hearing on a Tuesday morning. He sat beside Marcus in the gallery, his good gray suit on, and watched Jerome Banks, 27 years old, 7 years lost thin in the way of someone who has spent years in an environment where thinness is less a choice than a condition, stand with his family. As the judge read the vacatur and the courtroom began the procedural work of returning to him what had been taken. When it was over and the families had found each other in the courthouse corridor, Jerome's mother looked across the crowd and found Elroy and held his gaze with the recognition that Marcus had seen in the courtroom itself. The recognition of people connected by a story that neither of them had asked to be part of, and who had arrived through the efforts of others and through the law when it worked as it was supposed to work at a different chapter of that story than the one it had seemed to be heading toward. The Beaumont-Cole consent decree, named in the Justice Department's formal announcement for Elroy Beaumont and Judge Adrian Cole, was designated as a national model for rural law enforcement reform. The model emphasized real-time body camera monitoring, independent civilian review with subpoena authority, mandatory civil rights training, and a transparent complaint process administered outside the department being monitored. Marcus was asked to oversee the implementation in Caldwell County for 1 year at minimum. He said yes. On the morning that the implementation officially began, Elroy's Buick was returned to Beaumont Lane from Dale Jr.'s lot. Detailed polished the original smell of eucalyptus oil, somehow still faintly present, or perhaps replaced by something similar, by someone who had noticed the sachet above the visor. Marcus drove it home from the lot himself slowly, with his hands at 10 and 2, and when he pulled into the driveway, he sat in the car for a moment. On the passenger seat was the white pharmacy bag. It was a new one. Marcus had picked it up from the pharmacy that morning, the same Tuesday afternoon pharmacy. Run that Elroy had been making for 3 years, but it sat in the same place, and it had the same white paper and the same prescription label with Elroy's name on it. Marcus had put it there deliberately. He did not know exactly why, except that it seemed important to complete something that had been interrupted, to put back in its place the ordinary and necessary thing that had been taken from it. He brought the car to the door. He handed his father the keys. Elroy looked at the car and then at his son and then at the bag on the passenger seat, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Elroy took the keys. On the following Thursday morning, Marcus followed his father's Buick down Route 11 at exactly 32 miles per hour, 2 car lengths back on the same stretch of road where the lights had appeared in September's last week. The Buick moved steadily and correctly between its lane markings. Sam Cooke was playing on the AM radio and was audible through the Buick's open windows even at this distance. The pine trees on either side of the road had gone brown with the season, and the sky above them was the clear, cold blue of a Georgia December morning. No lights appeared behind them. They drove to the end of the Route 11 corridor and turned off onto the county road where the mail route had once ended, and they parked on the shoulder near the old oak tree that Elroy had used for 38 years as his turnaround point, the place where he stopped, rested, drank from his thermos, and began the 6 miles back. They got out of their cars and stood on the shoulder with the quiet road in front of them, and the sky above them, and the pine trees holding their silence in the way pines do all year long, regardless of the season. Elroy reached into his shirt pocket and touched Clara's prayer card through the fabric. He did not take it out. He just held it there for a moment through the cloth, the way a man holds something he has carried for a long time and does not want to put down. "The coffee is good here," he said. "You said you'd stay as long as the coffee was good." "The coffee is good," Marcus said. And the stories. Marcus looked at the road. He thought about the 9-year-old in the photograph, and the man with the postal bag, and the 38 years of rain and sleet and snow and everything that had been walked through without complaint. He thought about the holding cell and the break room and the courtroom and the wingback chair and the pharmacy bag on the passenger seat. "We have a new one," he said. Colt Mercer entered the federal correctional system as the most thoroughly documented corrupt law enforcement officer in the history of Caldwell County's judicial record, and the weight of 34 years settled on him not as a punishment from outside, but as a truth he carried inside, the specific, inescapable truth that he had built everything he had on the premise that certain people did not matter, and that this premise held long enough and acted on consistently enough had consumed itself and everything built on it. The men who shared his cell block knew his name and what he had done, the way news travels in closed systems, and the particular status that a disgraced law enforcement officer occupies in such systems is one that even the cruelest imagination can barely improve upon. He would have 34 years to understand what it felt like to be in a place from which you could not simply drive away. Elroy Beaumont returned to the 6-mile postal route 3 mornings a week as a volunteer, delivering meals for the county's senior program through an organization that had been operating since before his retirement, and that had asked him the previous spring whether he might want to come back for a few hours a week. He drove the same roads and passed the same houses and waved at the same people who waved at him, and the Buick moved at 32 in a 35. And the sachet above the visor smelled of eucalyptus oil, and Clara's prayer card was in his breast pocket, and not once on any morning that fall or winter did the lights appear behind him. He stopped thinking about whether they might. Marcus Beaumont drove back to Atlanta on a Sunday evening in late January, after a year spent overseeing the implementation of the Beaumont coal model in Caldwell County, and he passed the gas station on the county line where he had stopped in September with his hands tight on the wheel and the photograph in the glove box, and 300 miles of distance between him and something he could not fix by arriving faster. This time he did not slow down. The road was clear, and the porch light on Beaumont Lane was on behind him. It was always on, and somewhere in front of him, Atlanta's skyline was building itself against the winter sky, and the work was continuing as it always had, as it always would. The case file for Operation Landlord was closed. The cases it had opened in other counties in other states in the offices of investigators who had read the Beaumont coal documentation and had begun asking the same questions about their own corridors and their own records and their own 340 stops were just beginning. If this story of justice, accountability, and a son's loyalty moved you, please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story of karma, truth, and the law working the way it was always meant to work. Drop a comment below. Did Mercer get what he deserved, or should it have been more? We read every single one. Thank you for watching. The truth always finds a way out.